Okay, let's look at some of these others. We're not going to go through every one of them in detail. Some of them we will illustrate better later on. Concealment, exposure. This is just talking about how private people want their lives to be, and how important it is to keep faults hidden. In America, when an election is coming up, any candidate, he can count, especially for a high position, he can count on his life being very much searched out, his background. And if he ever did an illegal deal or whatever, if there's any kind of scandal in his background, it's going to be pulled up, and then the public gets the chance to decide how much that matters on whether they would vote for him or not, how much it still would affect their judgment of him. And so there are some cultures, the Far Eastern cultures would tend much more to be very private on that kind of thing. There's what's called the loss of face. In other words, your face being your image and the status that you have. And if you are seen to have failed in something, you lose face. You lose part of that image that you are trying to maintain. And so whenever they're negotiating, whether it's concluding a war and writing a treaty or whatever they're trying to do, you always have to try to come out with a deal that will make the other leader not look too bad, and even try to make a deal where he can claim to his people that he won. Okay, so maybe your army drove his army out, and he's going to have to give up this territory. But before he will do that, rather than having them fight to the last man, you've got to make some kind of deal with him where you give him something that he can show the people, all right, we fought and we got this, we succeeded, where he doesn't lose face. So, because that's the image, that's the respect, sense of respect he has with his people. Constancy and mutability. Mutability is changeable. Constancy is staying the same. Do we believe that a person can change? Okay, that's what that's talking about. Does a person change? Does a person get better or worse? Is his character always the same? Some cultures would say, once a person is branded with a certain mark and they think a certain thing about him, it'll never be the same. He'll never be able to live that down. Other cultures do. Crisis and non-crisis. Sherwood Lingenfelder told the story about the hurricane. Remember that? And the warning came out, there's going to be a hurricane. And so he rushes around, hey guys, there's going to be a hurricane. And they don't really react. And they don't make any preparation. And then the hurricane hits. And so they're out there trying, this stuff floating in the water that they're trying to save and all this damage. And he's thinking, why in the world didn't they listen? We could have prevented all this loss. Okay? But their response was, or their attitude was, we get 20 hurricane warnings a year. Okay? We can't close up everything and, and do that every time we get a hurricane warning. And so they have learned to ignore the warnings, and then just once in a while when a rare hurricane comes, then they just make the best of it. So crisis orientation means you take precautions and you secure everything. A non-crisis is that you don't worry about much and you just deal with it when it happens. And you get two people working together that are at opposite extremes on that. It gets very frustrating for both of them. And especially because they don't understand each other, usually. The person who doesn't worry about anything, and you are worried about something, he's not going to explain in his mind, okay, this person has a crisis orientation and I don't. He's going to come up with some other reason why you are trying to make him do something, because he doesn't understand crisis orientation. He doesn't know anybody has crisis orientation. So for you to be trying to make him do this stuff, he may even impute wrong motives to you. You just want to be bossy. You just want to be in control, whatever. Because he doesn't understand. A lot of these have that. I'll give you some good stories about this a little later on. Dichotomistic versus holistic. So black and white, right and wrong, versus everything just kind of merged together. Issues not really clear. Diffuseness. Specificity. Do you think of people as individuals or as part of a group? American, European culture would tend to be individualized. Eastern and African, and many of those cultures would be much more likely to think of a person's identity as being part of their family, part of their group. Stereotypes is what we would call them. In the States, a lot of people very much resent you assuming something about them because they are from a particular group. But in other parts of the world, they would expect you to assume certain things about them because they're part of their group. Doing, being, becoming. What is most important? What you are doing, what you are, or what you are growing into. Good, neutral, evil. What is the nature of people? And a lot of course, theological implications come into this. Guilt versus shame. This is something that our culture is changing in, I think. Guilt means like objective guilt. So a person has done wrong, and so legally they have broken the requirements, they are guilty. So I'm not talking about whether somebody feels guilty or not, they just are guilty. They did wrong, so they're guilty. And so in our minds, that's a technical thing that either you were wrong or you were not. It doesn't matter whether anybody knows about it. If you were wrong, you were wrong. If you broke the law, you broke the law. Because to them, it's like it goes on this eternal record. All right? There are others that don't see it that way. They see it more as like a collective conscience. And so it's what others think about them that makes a difference. Okay, we are going to skim over. Let me pick out just a couple of these that we will talk about a little further on. Let's, okay, individualism, collectivism, just take a moment on that one. Do you consider your individual decisions to be important? Or do you need the group to act together in everything that you do? There are some cultures where a person would not dream of, on his own, making the decision to go off somewhere to college. Because he would consider that not to be a decision for him to make. The decision has to be made by the group that he's a part of, because he's part of the family and he's got responsibilities. And if he goes off to college, it's going to be because the extended family decided that he was a good person to invest in and send off, because someday he would be able then to help the family. He would get an occupation. So the extended family might help a person become a doctor, for example, knowing that having a doctor is going to mean that the whole family is going to be benefited. Okay? So it's not just one person saying, I'd like to be a doctor. Guess what? Mom and Dad, I'm going to go be a doctor. Bye. See you all, in so many years. That would not happen in some cultures. It's a collective decision, and you're part of the family, and so you make the decision with the family. Now, some people, if we grow up in a very individualistic society, you'd be very uncomfortable with that. Say, well, you mean I can't go to college unless Mom and Dad and Uncle George and Aunt Lucille and everybody thinks that I should? That would feel very smothering and oppressive to many of us, right? But there are assets also to having the family on your side. Dropping down a little bit, letter R, short versus long power distance. In some cultures, powerful leaders can be approached by their followers and share power with them. In other cultures, powerful leaders remain aloof of their followers and keep all their power to themselves. So there's like a status level that makes them unapproachable and puts them beyond accountability too, to a great extent. So I remember in Ukraine we had a leader, a national guy, who was a lot of power was put into his hands, and when we had a big meeting of the missionaries and staff and were questioning him about some of this, he was very upset, his wife was very upset, and not just that he might be falsely accused, but that he would even be questioned. They were upset that he would even be questioned, because to them, once you reach a certain status, you are beyond accountability. And it doesn't even mean that everybody trusts you that you're doing right. It's that it's none of their business whether you're doing right. In fact, they might even assume that you're doing wrong. They might even assume that you're doing crooked stuff, but they're not supposed to ask because you have reached a level where you are beyond being approached, beyond being questioned. And that's a cultural thing.
Well, what if that cultural element is just plain out wrong? Like that.
Well,
I mean, there's no one's above accountability. But authority must have accountability if there's going to be a properly functioning society, or church, or any social structure. I mean, you have to have that.
Yeah. You have to lay the foundation of what accountability, biblical concepts of accountability. And you'd have to do it trying to make sure respect was maintained for the person who's in authority, and yet, and of course, you know, hindsight, they say, is always 20/20, but really it's not. You don't, even after things have happened, you don't really always understand what happened. But before people are put in those positions, it's better if they have a good concept of the accountability that they should be taking on. And just a biblical concept, okay, here are responsibilities. You are leading a spiritual community. We all have input into this. You know, just trying to establish those concepts.
Yeah, because a lot of the stuff you're pointing out, it leads to unproductivity, it leads to inefficiency. And if you look at all the traits, groupthink, no personal responsibility, collectivism, emphasis on feelings, all those things lead to, result in like societies like Russia during the age of communism. It just results in social structures that are not as good as a free society would produce.
Right.
So I don't think it's just culture. I think there's a reason those countries are in the third world still. I mean, there's a reason their roads are run down. There's a reason a lot of that stuff is like the way it is. It's their culture. And if their culture is just merely a compilation of what was your, it's a collection of the characteristics of a way of life, and it's, I mean, there can be unredeemed aspects to a culture as well that need to be redeemed. It's not just it's not just a way that your culture has. It is. No, there needs to be some social reform. There needs to be a different way of approaching it. And our founding fathers saw that. And the divine right of kings, yeah, that was a cultural assumption back in the 1700s, but it was just wrong. And our founding fathers saw that, and they wanted to correct that. So I think that there is certain elements of culture that must be corrected if there's going to be any social progress.
You're right, and the section we're going into is cultural judgment. That's what you're talking about, how to evaluate aspects of the culture. And I don't want to give the wrong impression. When I say that something is cultural, or just part of somebody's culture, that doesn't just mean, okay, then this is fine. This is the way they do it. This is culture. Because as Christians engaged in mission, and for that matter, if you were in business or politics or whatever, if you were trying to interact with other cultures, it doesn't mean that you just, anything that can be explained as cultural then has to be accepted without criticism. Okay? And we're going to talk about a system of how to approach that. Now, one thing you mentioned that is good is, but raises an issue. How do you evaluate? There's the pragmatic approach where you could say which culture has accomplished the most. And one way is to look at the roads, look at the technology, look at the prosperity. There are others who would say, no, wait a minute, you're looking at it from one angle. Is it really just who can make things work the best and accomplish the most in that way? What about other standards like the importance of relationship or the importance of living in harmony with the ecology instead of destroying it, things like that. There are other standards to bring to bear. And we'll get into that a little bit. It's interesting. And what is happening in our culture these days is we are being pushed to move to a different kind of standard to evaluate our own culture and the culture of others. And we're being pushed into an unworkable thing.